they ran 4 stories. They ran an editorial basically saying the case for war was now irrefutable. And they ran 4 op-ed page pieces, all of them favorable, gushing. One of them by Mary McGrory, who ran a much looked at column, said, "I'm persuaded." So it's sort of like this, there was like a mass sort of delusion that took root in the media. I mean, it's incredible. And
for those of us who have some historical knowledge of the role of the press in American society, this is not really surprising. Whether it's the lead up to Mexican War, whether it's the lead up to the Spanish-American War.
You go back further than I do.
You can, at least what I've read about it, is that this has been a regular feature of the American press in major conflicts, creating a drumbeat in the population for war, regardless of what the facts are. And I think I've always maintained that the biggest test of a journalist, of any journalist in any country, is what do you do when your country goes to war? Because inevitably, in every war, all governments try to persuade their people that the war is justified, but obviously in every war, at least one side is wrong, if not both. But the press in any country generally falls in line when the call to war goes out from their government.
Noam Chomsky quotes Walter Lippmann saying it's the press manufactures consent for war.
Well, I think the war issue is part of this broader phenomenon that I see of the pack mentality. Journalists love to run together in packs. There is a sort of allergy against being straying too far from the pack. So not only war, but when there's a consensus, when there's conventional wisdom, although as you pointed out, there was hardly a consensus on the war, but within the establishment, there sort of was. And the media they are so spineless. That's the word that comes to mind. As I've said in the past, they like to show courage when they know they're going to be applauded for it. But at times when courage really requires standing up and sort of maybe taking some brickbats, some heat, they hate to do it.
I mean, let's just look at the reality on the ground at that time, because some might say, well, you have hindsight here. No, February 5th is Colin Powell's address. February 15th, the large mass protest in the history of the world. The numbers vary: 10 million, 20 million, 30 million people around the globe rocked globe for peace. And yet the response in the U.S. media were some big pictures, but in terms of what's proportionate to this level of mass protest, that's what they were up against, and yet they were still broadcasting the voices of this minority elite.
Well, not only that, while people were in the streets around the world, as you point out, in the UN community, reports were coming out from Mohammed al-Baradi and the International Atomic Energy Agency basically saying, look, our inspectors have gone to over 100 sites. We have not found any evidence of any nuclear program there. These reports were put out. I went back again and looked. They were all these pro forma reports on the inside pages of these newspapers. And meanwhile, when Colin Powell, I did a contrast between Colin Powell's speech and this sort of gushing coverage and the al-Baradi comments, which were basically ignored. And they right there in real time were saying, we cannot find any evidence of this nuclear program that Dick Cheney and all these others are, and Colin Powell are talking about.
My brother David Goodman and I wrote the book The Exception to the Rulers, where we're talking about this media criticism. The corporate media will not touch it, though it's become a national bestseller, which is remarkable because they won't touch it because we're taking on them. The subtitle, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. But one of the things we point out is in that conference where the drumbeat started, that was Bush and Blair in September of 2002. This is after Andrew Card was asked why they weren't pushing harder. Bush was on the Crawford Ranch on an extended vacation. Why weren't they pushing harder to justify the imminent war? And Andrew Card, the former GM lobbyist, now the chief of staff, said from a marketing point of view, we don't introduce new products in August. So in September, Bush and Blair at Camp David hold that news conference, and they announced that Saddam Hussein was going to get nuclear weapons within 6 months. And according to a report from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, all the media covered this press conference. Very few mentioned. The Washington Post buried many paragraphs later that the IAEA had come out with no such report. George Bush had crowed, we don't need much more. He said, how much more evidence do we need? Our response was, well, any evidence would have helped. Here you had the IAEA cited. You'd think the reporters would go to the IAEA, and that there's no such report.
I actually looked into that when I was doing my research, and that statement was based on a New York Times article several days earlier, which itself the IAEA flipped out over. I talked to the people in Vienna at the IAEA, and they said, my God, the New York Times ran this article that made it sound like we were finding that that Iraq is engaging in all this new suspicious activity. So they run this report on page A7. Bush picks it up, says the IAEA has come out with this. And you're absolutely right. The people at the IAEA were tearing their hair out. They said, no one called us to confirm or find out more about this report Bush referred to. So, yes, they picked it up, they meekly ran with it, and it's a perfect case of how just the most basic repertorial skepticism or even follow-up was missed in this case.
It's fascinating that Leonard Downey, the executive editor of the Washington Post, puts his own quotes to a story about their failure. Because, he recently published a book, The News About the News, American Journalism in Peril, where he criticized the continuing lack of serious attention to news and investigative reporting. And although he said that there were always exceptions, and now we find that shortly after publishing that book, he then is guilty of the very same things that he's criticizing the rest of the media for.
Oh, and also, you just came out with this report, How Long Must We Wait, with Joe Torres, looking at the representation of minority reporters in this country. And I can't help but think that militarism and this exclusion in the media of people of color as reporters, that it also weighs in here. Because if you look at the population in this country that was most opposed to war, is African Americans. Very few represented in the mainstream media in this country.
Overwhelmingly, yeah. I think the composition of the National Press Corps covering the Pentagon and covering the White House had been a little different. You might have gotten somewhat different perspective. I know I was fascinated by a T-shirt that was on sale at the Unity Convention by the Native American journalists, which had a picture of 4 Native Americans on horseback with rifles, and the T-shirt says "Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492," so that I think that a Native American journalists some of them might have had a different perspective on how we are practicing the war on terrorism in Iraq.
We're talking to Michael Massing, and we almost have to go, but talking about looking back, you did this big piece in the New York Review of Books, and you really critiqued the New York Times.
And the Washington Post.
And the Washington Post.
Degree.
And Judith Miller responded. You talked about Judith Miller's front page drumbeat stories in the Times, that the Times, well, some called it a mea culpa on page 810. We call it a kind of culpa. But what has come of that? And what do you think at this point? What kind of difference do you think this critique has made? Do you think that box made any difference?
Well, the Times in that box said, we realize that we fell down in the run-up to the war, and we are going to show that we are doing better, and the proof will be in what we do. So since then, what has Times done? In fact, on the Abu Ghraib scandal, it was late on that by several. It just did not pay attention. Then when they realized that they blew it, they threw everything they had into it. And it shows what the Times can do when it really sets its mind to it. But again, it was almost like the pack was in action. They had, I would say, for 1 month, a story on the front page every day. Meanwhile, everything else gets squeezed out. And with all this events going on in Iraq with the Shiites and the sort of uprising there. I mean, again, the Times is late to that story. The big test for the Times and the Post is going to be, do these mea culpas ultimately lead to a change in the type of reporting? And on that, the jury is still out.
Michael Massing, thank you very much for being with us. I look forward to reading your book, Now They Tell Us. Michael Massing, the author of a big piece in the New York Review of Books on the press coverage in the lead up to the invasion and occupation. This